Few figures stand out in history quite like Alexander the Great. A skilled strategist in wartime and courageous on the battlefield, he might be the greatest military leader and warrior of all time. But what did Alexander do to achieve such fame? And what drove him to build such an empire? Who was the man beneath the legend? We'll seek out answers to these questions and more tonight. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the sleepy history of Alexander the Great. In ancient Macedonia, or present-day northern Greece, a tradesman is attempting to sell a horse to a king. It's not going well, because while the horse is magnificent, it's so wild and unpredictable that none can tame it. Philip II, King of Macedonia, has no interest in buying such a dangerous animal, until his son Alexander begs him to buy it for him. Few could have predicted what the boy would go on to achieve, or the victories he'd win, many atop that very same horse. Even then, at just 10 years old, Alexander showed hints of the greatness that was to come. Some would later claim that he'd been destined for greatness, even prior to conception. Tales were told about Alexander's birth in the city of Pella in 356 BCE. He was the son of King Philip II of Macedonia and Olympias of Epirus, the most important of Philip's wives. Legend has it that she'd dreamt of her womb being struck by thunderbolts right before the marriage was consummated. The contemporary historian and biographer Plutarch echoed the story and another that followed, that sometime later, Philip saw himself in a dream, using a seal engraved with the image of a lion to secure his wife's womb. To Plutarch and many others, the implications were clear. Alexander was the son of a god, specifically Zeus, the king of the gods, who ruled the sky and weather, and whose symbol was a thunderbolt. Even those who doubted such beginnings might have sensed that the boy had a very bright future. His birth date seemed showered in good fortune, being that Philip's generals won a great victory in battle and his horses triumphed at the Olympic Games. However, his birth also coincided with something far less pleasant, a devastating fire at the temple of Artemis and Ephesus. It was said that Artemis, who was the goddess of childbirth, wasn't there to protect her great temple, because she was away in Pella overseeing Alexander's birth. Most likely, such myths were developed over time by his mother, supporters, or even the man himself. Or even centuries later, when people sought to explain his achievements by making it seem like he was the son of a god. In reality, Alexander was a lot like his father, Philip, who had ruled Macedonia since 359 BCE. Philip was an adept and ambitious leader, and skilled in the art of both diplomacy and warfare. He expanded his kingdom one battle at a time. Under him, Macedonia had grown from a place of no importance to a vast kingdom that dominated much of ancient Greece. Alexander's childhood was spent in Pella, which was quickly becoming a center of knowledge and culture. He was raised in the palace and cared for by a nurse, a woman who was the sister of his future general. Once he was old enough, he was privately tutored, receiving the finest education available at the time. With his tutor, Leonidas, he learned to read and write. He studied mathematics and learned to speak other languages. From the age of 7, he gained another tutor too, Lysimachus of Acarnania, one of his father's generals. He schooled Alexander in the ways of Macedonian nobility and taught the boy how to become a man. He was taught how to play the lyre, a small handheld harp, as well as how to fight with and without weapons. Also how to hunt and ride on horseback, which is how he tamed the wild horse at the age of 10, where other grown men had failed before him. As Plutarch told it, Philip was moved to tears at the sight of his son's courage and determination. "My boy," he told him, "you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." Philip bought the horse for his son. It was named Bucephalus, translated as oxhead. The magnificent animal would be Alexander's close companion until it passed away of natural causes at the age of 30. It was clear to everyone that the boy had potential, but he was still a boy and in need of education. So, at 13 years old, he was sent to Mysa, to the ancient Greek equivalent of a prestigious boarding school. Philip sought out the very best of teachers to educate Alexander and the other noble children. He employed none other than Aristotle, the renowned polymath and great philosopher of the day. Over the 3 years that Alexander spent in Mysa, he took daily lessons at the Temple of the Nymphs. Aristotle's curriculum covered morals and philosophy, as well as logic, art, politics, and religion. It's said that Alexander liked to walk with his teacher in the expansive nature that surrounded the sanctuary, and that Aristotle often recited the poems of Homer as they strolled beside the river, beneath the shade of trees. Alexander was so fascinated with the story of Troy's downfall that later he would carry the Iliad everywhere he went. He modeled himself on the warrior Achilles, eventually building a legacy that would rival that of the heroes. Alexander's time in Mysa proved fruitful. Along with gaining a broad education, he developed friendships that would last a lifetime. Some of the other students he'd lived with would later become his generals and comrades in arms. He was called home at 16 years old, and his formal education came to an end. But his real-life education was only just beginning. He was about to face his first big challenge. His father had declared war against the Greek colony of Byzantium, so he needed to leave Macedon and head off into battle. It speaks volumes about the faith that he had in Alexander, that he chose to place the 16-year-old in charge of the kingdom. And it wasn't long before that decision was tested, as enemies sought to take advantage of Philip's absence. A Thracian tribe known as the Mighty rose up in rebellion. If they'd thought the city weak, they were quickly proved wrong. Alexander put down the rebels quickly and decisively, driving them out of their land and founding the colony of Alexandropolis in its place. His father was so impressed when he returned from Byzantium that he tasked him with stifling any other small uprisings. Over the next few years, Alexander was tried and tested across a variety of battles and military campaigns. He traveled to nearby colonies and suppressed rebellions, and is even said to have saved his father's life when fighting alongside him against the city of Perinthus. Alexander became a key player in Philip's plans to gain dominance over a unified Greece. He was not only a son, but a trusted general with the courage and expertise to lead their men to victory. After the events in Perinthus, Philip remained in Thrace, where he readied himself to take the city of Amphissa. In order to distract states who might intervene in their defense, Alexander went south and made it appear as if he would attack Illyria. This resulted in the Illyrians invading Macedonia, only to be defeated by Alexander's forces. It was 338 BCE when Philip's army joined Alexander's. Together, they marched south, taking Thermopylae from the Thebans and capturing Eladia near Athens. Despite Philip's attempts at diplomacy, Athens aligned with Thebes against him, which meant he would have to fight their united forces. The battle took place near the village of Chaeronea in Thebes, and here again, Alexander played a crucial role. Philip broke through the Athenian line at the head of the army's right wing. Meanwhile, Alexander commanded the left wing of their forces and broke through the Theban defenses. Between them, they managed to divide and conquer, eventually claiming victory over Athens and Thebes. Afterwards, they went south through the Peloponnese region on their way to Corinth. Once there, Philip formed a Hellenic alliance with himself as the hegemon or supreme commander. Sometimes called the League of Corinth, it was essentially an alliance of Greek city-states excluding Sparta. Now that he wielded power over a unified Greece, Philip planned to attack the Persian Empire. But first, he had to attend to personal matters and marry the woman who'd be his 8th wife. He'd fallen in love with the niece of his general, Attalus, a young Macedonian beauty named Cleopatra Eurydice. Unfortunately, the match put strain on Philip's relationship with his son. Cleopatra's offspring would be full Macedonian, whereas Alexander was only half Macedonian. Thus, any sons that she had with Philip might be placed above him in the line of succession. An argument erupted at the couple's wedding feast in Pella, after a drunk Attalus prayed loudly to the gods that Philip and his niece produce a legitimate heir. Overhearing this, an enraged Alexander threw a cup at his head, shouting, "What am I then? A bastard?" According to Plutarch, Philip was also very drunk and took the side of his general over his son. The historian reports that he might have even run Alexander through had he not slipped and fallen as he came towards him. It's said that Alexander then insulted the king as he lay fallen in a drunken state. He mocked his father's plans to move into Asia when he couldn't even switch chairs. See there, the man who makes preparations to pass out of Europe into Asia, overturned in passing from one seat to another. Alexander was so hurt by his father's actions that he left the city right after the wedding. He took his mother, Olympias, to the safety of her homeland, where his uncle Alexander ruled as king of Epirus. Next, he went on without her into the region of Illyria, at the western end of the Balkan Peninsula. He stayed in the court of the Illyrian king, where he was very well treated as a man of high standing. While he was there, his father sent word that he'd never intended to displace him as heir. And so, after 6 months away, Alexander returned to Pella, having heard that his father longed to see him. Unfortunately, more trouble was already brewing with the marriage proposal that was on the table. Alexander's older half-brother, Philip Aridius, had been matched to the daughter of the Persian governor of Caria. This, in and of itself, wasn't a problem until Alexander's mother and many of his friends began to whisper conspiracies in his ear. To them, it was a sign of his father's intention to make Aristides the next king instead of him. Believing their lies, he sent a message to Caria with an offer of his own hand in marriage instead of his brother's. Philip found out and rebuked him for his poor judgment before exiling the 4 friends who had seemingly misled him. He said that he hadn't arranged the marriage for Alexander because he thought his son deserved a better bride. A daughter of Caria was fine for Aristides, but he wanted a woman of more noble birth to wed Alexander. In many ways, it's fortunate that there was a thawing of the tension, because unbeknownst to either Alexander or Philip, their time together on earth would soon come to an end. Philip would be assassinated in 336 BCE at the wedding of Alexander of Epirus and Cleopatra of Macedon. The Macedonian royal family had traveled north to Agai for the marriage of Alexander's uncle to his sister Cleopatra. Philip was struck by one of his own bodyguards as he entered the town's theater where crowds were seated. The reasons for the assassination remain unclear, but the events that unfolded were surely as dramatic as any play. At 20 years old, Alexander was hailed as king, just meters away from his father's body. It's hard to imagine a more overwhelming situation, and Alexander was no doubt shaken. Yet, still he was ready to take decisive action against any more troublemakers looking to take his throne. He ordered the execution of political rivals and those who'd been involved in his father's assassination. This included his cousin and 2 Macedonian princes and Cleopatra's uncle, the general Attalus, with whom he'd argued at Philip's wedding. Meanwhile, his mother arranged the deaths of Philip's 8th wife, Cleopatra, as well as her daughter, Alexander's stepsister. Alexander was said to be furious when he heard this, seeing neither of the women as a threat to his rule. But he couldn't stay angry with his mother for too long. He was too busy responding to the very real threats posed by city-states that rose up in revolt. Cities like Athens, that had only recently been conquered, saw Philip's death as an opportunity to break free. Against his advisor's suggestion that he win them back with diplomacy, he led an army of 3,000 south towards Thessaly. The newly crowned king was just 20 years old, but had already learned to trust his own judgment. It was a bold move and very effective. His enemies melted at the sight of such a force. One by one, the rebels surrendered. From Thessaly to Thermopylae, Athens to Corinth, There's a charming story from his time in Corinth when he encountered the Greek philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. The young king was said to ask what he could do for the philosopher, perhaps expecting a list of demands. But Diogenes grumbled that he should move out of the way, and he was blocking the sunlight that the philosopher was enjoying. Apparently, Alexander found this highly amusing and is reported to have said, "If I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes." It's interesting that the king, ambitious as he was, would admire the philosopher's easy contentment. Perhaps some part of him felt envious of a man who could be so happy with so very little. Of course, if it weren't for Alexander's ambition, we likely wouldn't be hearing about his story today. For it was also in Corinth that he was appointed hegemon, supreme commander of the Greek city-states. Alexander would take the lead in the war against Persia, but only after he'd ensured that Macedonia was secure. Another uprising forced him to take the army east, where he suppressed the Thracians and then the Illyrian chieftains. The problem for Alexander was that at this point in time, his kingdom had grown so large that it was hard to manage. He would put down rebels in one part of the kingdom, only for another to crop up elsewhere. He wanted to prevent further rebellion and felt that he needed to assert his dominance. So, once he'd regained control of the northern states, he took his army south into Thebes. Of all the southern states, it was only Thebes that had chosen to rebel against his rule. As punishment, he opted to destroy the city completely, forming a range of smaller cities for the former Thebans to live in. Alexander had made an example of Thebes, one that other city-states didn't want to follow. It was the move he needed to regain control of Greece, leaving him free to turn his attention towards Asia. His father had always dreamt of conquering the Persian Empire, but had his life cut short before he'd barely started. With his army of over 40,000 men, Alexander was determined to do what his father hadn't. He appointed Antipater, a trusted general and statesman, to rule as regent while he was away. And he gave the general a large army to deal with any problems that might arise. It was 334 BCE when he marched his soldiers into Asia. It must have been apparent right from the beginning that he was ready to use force over diplomatic efforts. He's said to have thrown a spear across the soil and given thanks to the gods for giving him Asia. The first major battle took place at Granicus River, which today is the River Biga in northwest Turkey. The Persians had an advantage in that they knew the landscape better, though their numbers were maybe half of Alexander's great army. Leading his men in a wedge-shaped assault, the king broke through the Persian line. The Greeks' spear-like lances proved highly effective in countering the javelins thrown by Persians. Ultimately, it was the Greeks who would triumph at Granicus, losing far fewer soldiers than Persians. They also captured 18,000 Greek mercenaries who had been paid to fight against them. Alexander ordered half to be executed as traitors, while the other half were sold into slavery. The prize of his victory was the city of Sardis, where he helped himself to a rich treasury. Then onwards he marched down the Ionian coastline, where many welcomed him with open arms. Some felt he'd freed them from their Persian masters and hoped that under the Greeks they'd have more independence. As for the places that weren't so willing to surrender, Alexander overcame them one at a time. He mounted a siege against Miletus, followed by another in Halicarnassus, the latter proving an especially difficult operation. The Persians in Halicarnassus, in the region of Caria, were a formidable force led by Memnon of Rhodes. Memnon had previously fought against Alexander's father and had successfully defended Byzantium against him. The Persians were ready to defend the city walls, but the Greeks drove them back using multiple catapults. As their enemies were stunned, Alexander's troops stormed in, breaking through the city walls and forcing the Persians to flee. Alexander reinstated Ada of Caria as queen, who'd previously been driven out of power by the Persians. She adopted Alexander as her son and heir, so that Halicarnassus would be his after her death. From here, the Greeks continued along the coastline, ensuring that the Persian navy had nowhere to land. They'd repeatedly tried to lure him into a battle at sea, but Alexander knew that his advantage was on land. He made his way to the city of Gordian, where legend has it he was tied to an ox cart with a rope. It was said that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become ruler of Asia. As the story goes, after studying it for a minute, Alexander pulled out his sword and simply cut the rope. Though it's most likely a myth, it speaks volumes about his character and his ability to think past arbitrary limitations. Such qualities led him to his next great victory, which took place in Issus against King Darius III. It was the first time that Alexander's army had been outnumbered, which is perhaps why Darius was so shocked at the loss. He ran from the battlefield, leaving behind his family and treasure, later attempting a peace treaty offering lands already lost. Alexander responded that as he was king of Asia, Any territorial decisions rested with him. By this point, in 332 BCE, the Greeks had taken Syria and most of the Levantine coastline. Word had spread of their skill and ferocity, while Alexander held a godlike mystique, a lot like Achilles, the warrior he'd so admired. Many places put up little to no resistance, fearing what they'd heard about the Greeks to be true. And where they did, Alexander took them by force, which only added to his reputation. One such place was the coastal island of Tyre, about a mile out in the Mediterranean Sea. He'd had it blockaded for over half a year, so that nothing could come in or go out. Meanwhile, his army had built a rocky causeway, which gave them a route to the city walls. Once Alexander had secured victory, he sought vengeance against the people for drawing him into a long siege. He ordered the execution of 8,000 men and had the women and children sold into slavery. The Greeks' next challenge came en route to Egypt, at the fortress of Gaza, which stood atop a great hill. Alexander's engineers warned him that the fortress was impenetrable, but of course, this only made him more determined. It took 3 attempts to breach the thick city walls, and there were many casualties along the way. Alexander himself was wounded in the shoulder, though the conquest was successful and the Greeks remained undefeated. Next, he was welcomed into the Jewish city of Jerusalem and shown a prophetic text in the great temple of Solomon. He was likened to a king in the book of Daniel, a king it was foretold would conquer the land. The reaction in Egypt was even better. He was hailed as a liberator and treated as well as a pharaoh. It was in northern Egypt that he built Alexandria, a city with a legacy nearly as large as his own. It would become famous for its lighthouse and library, and as a hub of trade, ancient learning, and culture. After Egypt, Alexander took his men northwards, where he faced a familiar foe in King Darius III. The king had mustered an army somewhere between 50,000 and 1,000,000, with a formidable front line, including 15 elephants and charioteers wielding scythes. Ever the tactician, Alexander adapted his plans, moving his light infantry to the front line. Archers and javelin throwers targeted oncoming forces, allowing chariots to pass through, where they were surrounded and taken prisoner. It would be the second of Alexander's victories against Darius III, who once again would run from the battlefield. He would later be murdered by one of his own generals, who himself would be handed over to the Greeks for execution. After claiming Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, Alexander's name rang out as the King of Kings. And yet, he wanted to go further. His sights were set on taking the Indian subcontinent. Delegates were sent ahead to the Indian clans to demand submission before the Greeks' arrival. Some complied, fearing what would happen if they didn't. Others refused and were taken by force. The Greeks' greatest challenge in India was in the Punjab region, where King Porus impressed Alexander with his courage and strategy. So much so that once he'd been defeated, Porus was allowed to remain in power as a co-ruler with Alexander. By now, Alexander had amassed a huge empire, larger than any that had come before it. And he would have carried on and gone deeper into India if his men hadn't refused to go any further. As loyal as they were, they'd been away from home for years. They were exhausted and homesick, and longed to see their families. So Alexander relented and promised they'd go home, conquering towns and villages along the way. He sent the older and disabled soldiers home directly, in an attempt to increase the army's morale. Unfortunately, this had the opposite effect. The men mistakenly thought they were all heading home and were so angry that they weren't, that they began to criticize the king publicly. They didn't like the way he'd dressed in Persian clothes, taken non-Greek wives, and adopted Persian customs, nor the way he'd appointed Persian officers into positions of power over Greek soldiers. Now, Alexander had to use diplomacy to win back the affections of his own men. He decreed that only Greek officers could command Greek soldiers, and arranged the marriage of senior officers to Persian noblewomen. He also threw an enormous banquet as a display of his gratitude towards his army. If there's one thing that Alexander liked to do, it was to celebrate with food and excessive amounts of wine. Despite calmness and self-control in many aspects of his life, he showed a lack of restraint when it came to alcohol. According to Plutarch, he had a violent temper, and no doubt this was worsened by the effects of drinking. One of his biggest regrets was killing his close friend Cletus after a drunken argument turned into a brawl. We should understand that as remarkable as he was, Alexander was as imperfect as any. In the end, it was likely his penchant for drinking that would prove to be his Achilles' heel. It was in 328 that, according to Plutarch, the king fell ill after a 24-hour drinking binge. He was only 32 when he passed away at Nebuchadnezzar's great palace in the city of Babylon. Some suggested that the king was poisoned, having fallen ill after drinking a bowl of unmixed wine. It's also possible that he caught some disease, his health being weakened by years of war and alcohol. He was laid to rest in a stunning gold tomb in the Egyptian capital of Alexandria. Meanwhile, his generals divided the empire between themselves and warred against each other in a battle for dominance. Centuries later, when the world looked very different, Roman emperors like Augustus would visit Alexander's tomb. Many were inspired by what he had accomplished, just as he himself had been inspired by Achilles. His achievements were so great, his reputation so mighty, that he'd gained an aura of godlike invincibility. It was only his death that reminded the world that Alexander the Great was actually mortal. He was a flesh and blood man, full of drive and ambition, a king determined to make his mark on the world. Alexander's legacy is that of a man who'd stop at nothing to fulfill his destiny.